Welcome everyone. In this video, we're going to take a look at the basics of rules and rule sets and how we can manage those with our Suricata instances. So this video will assume that you've already set up or installed Suricata, and how you did that will depend likely on the scenario, likely what your objectives are. We do have some videos that we've posted to help walk you through the installation, so I would refer you to those videos already in our YouTube channel. We'll also take a look at the documentation here, as there are a few things I want to point out. In order to then confirm that you have Suricata installed, you can open up a terminal and type in Suricata space -V. This will show you the current version of Suricata that you have installed on your system. As you can see here, I have Suricata version 6.0.0 release. Now, with the latest versions of Suricata, they are going to come installed, or what comes installed with them is Suricata-Update, which is really the de facto rule manager for Suricata. If we type in Suricata-Update space-H, we can get help information. So this is really just confirming that we have that Suricata-Update installed on our system. Now, I mentioned the documentation. Suricata maintains all of its documentation over at Read the Docs. So you can just search for Suricata Read the Docs on your favorite search engine, or as you can see here in the browser, we have suricata.readthedocs.io. And in this documentation, while there is certainly quite a bit here, the installation section is a great place to start if that is something that you haven't gone and already done. And if you're not familiar with installing Suricata, I would definitely recommend starting with these binary packages based off of the operating system that you want to install. And there's a number of operating systems here that you can go ahead and follow that installation for. Now, one of the first things that you'll likely want to do after installing Suricata is to go through a process of making sure that you have everything running and configured properly. And one way to do that is to have a rule set that will help generate alerts. Now, it's really important to note that Suricata can produce a lot of data without a rule set. You do not need those alerts for Suricata to provide you value on your network. From the Read the Docs, you can go to the output section and just browse through that, and you'll see all of the output that Suricata will generate. It can do information about protocol-specific logs, so HTTP, DNS, FTP, for examples. It can create full packet capture. It can get file information, as well as do file extraction on the wire. There's also information about TLS certificates, as well as create hashes, such as J3 and J3S. So there's a ton of information, a ton of data that Suricata can produce, and you don't necessarily need the alerts. But why we oftentimes have those alerts then is to help generate an alert that can draw our attention to something that's happened in the traffic, happened in your networks, that may tip off an investigation or help with some troubleshooting. Maybe it's time to perform some incident response. So that's what we're going to focus on here. Now, very similarly, Suricata-Update is also, the documentation is also maintained on the Read the Docs website. So you can see the URL, suricata-update.readthedocs.io. The documentation here isn't quite as extensive as Suricata, but there's definitely a lot here, more than we're going to be able to cover in this short video. So I would encourage you, as you're getting familiar with Suricata and Suricata-Update and rules, that you spend some time here just building up that background information for yourself. One of the things that I do want to cover here, though, at least point out, is that we don't really need to go through the installation of Suricata-Update, because that's going to come with our recent versions of Suricata. But I do want to take a moment and point out the directories and permissions. It is important to set this up correctly, because if you don't, it can sort of cascade in terms of the issues that you might have in terms of permissions when running Suricata-Update and running Suricata itself. So we really have two options here when it comes to these permissions, and you'll see in the notes for setting up the correct permissions and directories, one option is to go through and actually run through the series of commands to set the permissions and create the group, the Suricata group, and do everything proper. The other is just to simply run Suricata-Update as the sudo user, or with sudo. So we'll go sudo Suricata-Update. I'm going to opt in this demonstration for the latter. That is, we're not going to run Suricata-Update with sudo or as the root user. We're going to set up the permissions according to the documentation here. Now, in order to do that, I have created a script. You'll find the script available on GitHub and the link available in the description of the video. What this particular script does then, it's going to set up all of the permissions according to the documentation here. So if you want to spend a little bit of time just comparing what the script is doing to the documentation, you certainly can do that. But what we need to do in order to take advantage of that is to run the script from a terminal. So we can go back to the terminal, we can enter in sudo /setup suricata-update.sh, or whatever name you gave that script after you've downloaded that. We have to add the // in front of the script because that will tell the operating system to look in the current directory to execute the script. And then, of course, we also need to be in the same location in our terminal in the file system where we've downloaded that script. So once you run that, you should get pretty much no output. You may see if you run the script multiple times that the group Suricata already exists, and that's fine. When that group is created in the script, if it's already there, then it doesn't create it for you again. So it's really okay to run this script multiple times. Now we have the permissions set up. Now they're ready for us to continue to the next step, and that is to actually run Suricata-Update. Now, before we do that, what we're going to look at is how does the engine behave when there is no rule set available? Because by default, it's going to be configured to look in a specific location for a rule set. But if we haven't downloaded the rule set yet, it's likely it's going to generate an error. There is another script available. You'll see this is Suri ingest pcap. This is also linked to in the notes for this video. And what this script is doing is just trying to make it a little bit easier in order to process a pcap to generate our alerts. So one of the modes that Suricata can run in is an offline mode. That is, we can provide it a pcap file or tell it to look in a directory and process all the pcaps that are there. And the benefit to that is that we don't have to rely then on generating live traffic. Of course, in a production setting or there's any number of scenarios in which we'd want Suricata to be listening to traffic that is flowing over an interface. But in this case, then it's just a little bit easier because we can take a pcap that we know generates certain events, which we'll see in just a moment, and we can replay that pcap. So this particular script is similar to the previous in that we need to run it as the root user or run it with root privileges. So we'll use the sudo command in front of the script to execute it. It does ensure that the script will have sudo privileges. It then checks for one argument, which is the pcap file. So you just need to provide it with an absolute or a relative path to a pcap that you've downloaded, and I'll show you where you can get some of those in just a moment. It then clears the default eve.json file, which is the default output file for Suricata. That way, every time we run this, we only have data from that pcap that was being ran, and then the long command in order to run Suricata in this pcap mode, this offline mode. So the more relevant arguments here is -r that tells Suricata to start in offline mode and what pcap we want it to process, and then we're also telling it to use the default log location as well as to run the engine with our session user. After that, it's going to look into the contents of the eve.json file, which, as you probably can imagine from the extension of this file, it is a JSON file, and use JQ in order to query all of that output data that's there just to get the alerts and then print those out in the terminal. So that way we'll be able to see immediately if any alerts are generated. Now, one of the next things you'll probably want to consider then is how can you do more with managing alerts and you do more with managing that event data that's being generated. And that's something we'll save for another video. We'll look at things like Evebox and Kibana in terms of building dashboards and visualizations. Okay, so what about pcaps? Well, there's any number of places you can go to grab pcaps. Places like I maintain a GitHub here, as you can see, that has any number of samples that I have posted. Each one of these samples, or the vast majority of them, include the original malicious artifact, typically the executable, or maybe it's an Office document, as well as any network traffic, that pcap that was captured during analysis or execution. So for this demonstration, I'm going to grab this BetaBot pcap if you want to follow along exactly. If not, you can grab any pcaps from here, or again, any of the many sources, great sources that are out there for finding packet captures that contain something malicious, something that we know is going to generate a particular alert. If you want to drill down a little bit further, so say the BetaBot example, you'll notice that on the resulting README, there are oftentimes a number of alerts that are generated. So this is just another way to take the output that we're going to generate here in just a moment and compare it to what was generated at the time that I originally did this analysis. Keep in mind, your alerts might not always match up because I may have had different rules-enabled rule sources. But right now, the important thing is that we start to get some alerts to generate. So now we can go back to our terminal and we want to execute our Suri ingest pcap script. We want to ensure that we prefix this with sudo and then the // to execute the script in the current directory, and then one argument, which is betabot.pcap. Now, before I run that, you may get issues or permission errors. You might want to ensure that your scripts are executable after you've downloaded them. You can do that by using the chmod +x and then the argument being either one of those scripts. So if you get any errors from a terminal that you cannot execute the script, that's one of the first things to check. Okay, so let's go back now and let's run our script. Now keep in mind, what we're doing is we have not run Suricata-Update yet. So Suricata is installed, but we haven't run the Suricata-Update to get a rule set downloaded. And since it's configured to use a rule set, it's telling us. It's saying no rule files match the pattern. So a rule file was specified, but no rules were loaded. So that's a problem. It still went ahead and processed the pcap. If we were to look in the eve.json, we'd still get all that data that I mentioned earlier that you can look back in the documentation for, HTTP and DNS events and anything else that was there, but we didn't get the alerts. Now what we can do is we can run Suricata-Update. If we run Suricata-Update without any arguments, the default behavior is to go ahead and grab the emerging threats open rule set. And what you'll notice then is as Suricata-Update is running, it's giving you information about how it is processing the different sources, in this case just etopen, the number of rules that it's found, any of those rules that were disabled, where it's writing the rules to, as well as the total number of rules that were written and enabled. We added 28,496 because before we didn't have any. It's doing a final test, and as long as we don't see any errors, then we should be good to go. So now we can go back to our original Suri ingest pcap script and run it again. And you'll notice probably a couple of things. The most important is that once the script is done running, we'll have some alerts. So that'll give us something to investigate, and that'll confirm that everything appears to be configured properly. The other thing, as you're observing right now, is that it's taking a little bit longer for the script to run. And that is because Suricata now has to process and load all of those engines into all of those rules into the engine before it can process the pcap. So in general, the larger the rule set, the longer that's going to take. Now we can see the output. We have a number of alerts that were generated, info alerts such as a query for a suspicious.ga domain, a current events alert that we had an executable downloader that was a terse alphanumeric. So that means that the file name for the file was very short and just alphanumeric. We also have a policy alert that we have a PE file, exe or DLL Windows file downloaded. If we go back to the original event, you can see that this was a Office document, a malicious Office document, which has followed a fairly classic pattern in that Office document reached out to the internet to download the next stage, in this case an executable, the Trojan beta bot, and so we see that in the traffic. We see that in the alerts that were generated, and that we have our DNS queries typically, or likely this is where that executable was hosted, and then we have the download of that executable itself. We won't get into all the traffic here, but if you have Wireshark installed, you'll be able to take a look at the traffic itself. So we'll just open up Wireshark here real quick and filter up in this navigation or this filter bar with the HTTP event. And here we can see our GET request. So I'm going to right click on that and follow the HTTP stream. So we have a GET request for div.exe from this host, cinematics.ga. So here we can see essentially the HTTP request response that is responsible for all of the alerts that were generated. Okay, so what else can we do with Suricata-Update? Well, as you already have seen, we can run Suricata-Update-H to get a list of commands, to get help information. And the most probably important, at least for getting started, are the other commands down here. So I'll have these essentially sub commands that we'll want to run through. Again, there are a number of different options here, and it is something definitely to spend some time reviewing, not only here in the help from the tool itself, but then on read the docs. So when it comes to rules, one of the first things we have to consider is our sources. Where are we getting our rules from? So in order to do that, we can run the list sources command. And this will show you then all of the sources that Suricata-Update currently is configured to use. Sources can come from vendors, they can come from GitHubs, they can come from really any a local source that you want to create on your network. And with Suricata-Update, then you have the ability to not only list the sources as we see here, these are the default sources that were configured, but then add sources ourselves, add custom sources. Okay, so let's say that we want to, at this point in time, specifically enable etopen. So we need to take note of the name of the source because that is what the value that we'll use when we enable that source. So let's go back to Suricata-H. Here's the other commands. So we just did list sources. We can now also do list enabled sources. And you'll notice, here I'll go ahead and clear the screen, make that a little bit easier to see. List enabled sources, and you can see that there are no enabled sources. So we ran Suricata-Update because there was no enabled sources. It went ahead and just pulled from etopen. Let's say though that we want to specifically configure a source. So we'll say Suricata-Update enable source and then that source name. And what we should see at the very bottom of this output is that the source etopen is now enabled. And if we go back and list enabled sources, now we can see that our enabled source will show up. So we can run Suricata-Update again, and the effect at this point in time will be negligible because we've already updated etopen. But now it will specifically use etopen because it's an enabled source. Let's add another source. So we'll go back here and do a list sources. Another great resource for open source, freely available Suricata rules is from abuse.ch. And for this demonstration here, let's go ahead and grab the JA3 fingerprint set. If you're not familiar with JA3, it's essentially a hash that's generated from the TLS handshake, and it's one way to try to or attempt to fingerprint TLS connections, particularly those used by malware actors. So there's some great documentation out there on the JA3 GitHub. This was a project that was created by Salesforce. Okay, so I'm just going to scroll back up to the enable source command, paste in the source that I want to update. It looks like we have had success. That is now enabled. We can list enabled sources. See, we have both of those now as enabled. And now when we run Suricata-Update, what we should find is that as it is downloading these rule sets, we're gonna get a change in what was added. So here in our output, we have 98 rules that was added by adding that additional source. So we just have to let Suricata finish. We could then run the Suricata, the Suricata ingest pcap script again and observe if any additional alerts are generated. As I mentioned earlier, it's not always going to be the case that adding additional rules is going to guarantee that you'll get additional alerts. It just all depends on the rule set. And there is certainly a lot more of considerations when it comes to which rule sets do you enable, what sources do you use, how many rules should you have. It really depends on your environment. So again, we won't be able to get too deep into the fine tuning of it here in this video. This is just to get you up and running with Suricata-Update, but there is still a lot to consider. Now, if we want to disable any of our sources, all we have to do is disable the source. That'll take us back to a state where that source is not being used. So let's go ahead and do that. And we'll use the same JA3 source from the abuse.ch. We've got a successful message here in that we have been able to disable that source. And now we have to run Suricata-Update again if we want to apply that change. So just disabling it, just like enabling it, it doesn't update the rule file until we run Suricata-Update again. You'll notice now that we have removed 98. If you recall, previously we added 98, so that did have the desired effect in removing those rules from the rule file, our rule set that we're using, the rule file that is being, whoops, this one right here, that is being written to the file system and then used by Suricata in order to update the rule set. Now with PCAPs, it's very straightforward. We run Suricata-Update. It creates a new version of this file based off of the sources. We then run the engine. We start the engine to process the PCAP, so it loads that rule file. If this were a production sensor, then we would need to tell the engine to reload the rules on the fly, because once the engine has initialized, it uses the rule set that was on disk at the time that it starts. And there are some commands that are available in the documentation to help you to go ahead and navigate through that. Okay, something else to be aware of, with any of these commands, you can get help that's specific to those commands. So let's say we wanted to get a little bit more information about Suricata-Update add source. Here you can see that we can do Suricata-Update add source command and then -H. And then here is all of the specific help for that particular command. So you can go through now all of the different options, all the commands available that will help you to navigate the tool. Again, the basics are we have sources. There's some that are pre-configured. You can add custom sources. The sources will point to rules. Once you add a source, you have to enable that source. That becomes a part of your rule set. And then tell Suricata-Update to go ahead and update the rule set, that file, the rules file, based off of the sources that you have configured. At any point in time that you want to disable a source, you can use the command to disable the source, have to run Suricata-Update again to change that rule file, and then you can also remove sources. But disabling that source does not necessarily remove it. You have to specifically remove it. Okay, so again, I just wanted to get through the basics here of working with Suricata-Update, getting some rules downloaded and ready for the engine to use and generate some alerts. Some of the next things to consider, of course, we've already talked about it a little bit. What rule sources do you actually use? And how do you do this on a regular interval? So something that you certainly can consider with Suricata-Update is using it on a cron or some sort of a regular timer or interval to run and update your rule file as often as they are updated. And I would say that's probably the biggest consideration when determining how often to run it. If, for example, we only want to have ET open and ET open only publishes an update once a day at 3 o'clock in the morning, then there's no need to run Suricata-Update more regular than that. But you could certainly set that up as a scheduled task or a cron job or however you prefer to do that so that you have always the latest rules that are then downloaded and available for Suricata. Hope you enjoyed this video. Please feel free to reach out to us on the Suricata forums if you have any questions or need any further assistance.